Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something really fascinating. It's the LAPD Detective Operations Manual.
Yeah, it's a pretty dense document, but really interesting. It lays out all the procedures and guidelines that LAPD detectives follow. It's like a window into how they approach investigations.
It covers everything, right? From basic stuff like handling evidence to more specialized investigations like homicide or gang activity.
It's all in there.
Yeah.
Even things like dealing with extradition and witness protection. There's even a section on something called the Secret Service Fund.
Oh, yeah. That caught my eye too. It sounds kind of mysterious, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that's part of what makes this manual so interesting. It gives you a glimpse into a world that's usually hidden from public view.
Definitely. So before we get into the specifics, can you give us a quick overview of how the manual is structured?
Sure. It's basically organized like a giant encyclopedia, split into different volumes and chapters. Each one focuses on a particular aspect of detective work.
So it's designed to be easy for detectives to reference, even in the middle of a fast-paced investigation.
Exactly. They need to be able to find the information they need quickly and accurately.
Now, one thing that struck me is how the manual addresses the digital age. They have a whole section on electronic documents, or e-documents as they call them.
Right. It's interesting because it highlights the challenges that detectives face when dealing with digital evidence. Things like emails, text messages, social media posts, all that stuff.
It's a whole different ballgame than dealing with physical evidence, isn't it?
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. How do you even collect and preserve digital evidence in a way that's admissible in court? How do you analyze terabytes of data from a suspect's computer?
It's like finding a needle in a digital haystack. And then there's the issue of making sure that the evidence hasn't been tampered with.
Exactly. It's a whole new set of challenges for investigators, and the manual tries to address those challenges.
Okay, so let's move on to how detectives actually prioritize cases. The manual talks about categorizing cases as either Category 1 or Category 2. What's the difference?
Category 1 cases are the ones that are considered the most serious and most solvable. They get fast-tracked. These are things like cases involving firearms, hate crimes, missing juveniles.
So those are the cases where time is of the essence.
Right, exactly. There's a real sense of urgency with Category 1 cases.
Now, what about cleared cases? I was surprised to learn that a case can be marked cleared even if an arrest isn't made. How does that work?
Well, there are situations where, for whatever reason, an arrest just isn't possible, even if the detective knows who committed the crime.
So give me an example. What kind of situation would that be?
Let's say a detective has identified the perpetrator and has enough evidence to make an arrest, but then the suspect dies before they can be apprehended.
Oh, wow. So technically the case is solved, but
Right. But they can't make an arrest because the suspect is deceased. Or maybe a key witness refuses to cooperate, or the suspect flees the country and extradition isn't possible. In those cases, the case might be classified as cleared other.
cleared other. Interesting. It shows you that it's not always as simple as just making an arrest.
Definitely not. There are a lot of nuances to it.
Now, one of the things that really jumped out at me in the manual was the follow-up investigation form. This form, or 03.14.00, as it's numbered in the manual, seems incredibly important.
It's the main way that detectives document their work. They have to fill it out for every investigation.
And it's not just a simple checklist, right?
No. The instructions for filling out the form are incredibly detailed. It specifies exactly what information needs to be included and how it should be formatted.
So there's no room for sloppiness.
Not at all. It has to be accurate and complete. They even have specific instructions about things like striking out words rather than just checking boxes.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that detailed. Now, what about cases that involve multiple reports? Things could get pretty complicated keeping track of all that.
Absolutely. But the manual has a system for that too.
Yeah.
There's a specific format for documenting progress on multiple reports, all within a single document.
So it's like a master spreadsheet that keeps everything organized.
You got it. Detectives need to be able to see the big picture, even when they're dealing with a lot of different pieces of information.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the human element of detective work. I was intrigued by the section on interacting with victims and witnesses.
Yeah, that's a really important part of the job. Remember, detectives are dealing with real people who have been through traumatic experiences.
They're not just dealing with facts and evidence, they're dealing with emotions too.
Exactly. And the manual stresses the importance of building rapport with victims and witnesses, treating them with respect and sensitivity.
So it's about more than just getting information, it's about building trust.
Right. It's about making people feel comfortable enough to open up and share what they know.
And sometimes that can be difficult, especially if someone has been traumatized by a crime. They might be scared or reluctant to talk.
Absolutely. And that's where the detective skills come in. They have to be able to read people, to understand their motivations, and to build a relationship that's based on trust.
Now, I noticed a term in the manual that I found interesting: special relationship. What does that mean in the context of detective work?
It refers to the relationship that can sometimes develop between law enforcement and victims or witnesses, especially when there are potential threats involved.
So, for example, if a witness is worried about their safety because they've come forward with information about a crime.
Exactly. The detective might assure that witness that they'll be protected. But it's not just about giving someone a verbal assurance. It's about taking concrete steps to ensure their safety.
And the manual actually cites a real-life court case to illustrate this concept, right?
The case of Wallace,
Yeah.
it basically established that law enforcement has a duty of care towards people who might be in danger because they've cooperated with an investigation.
So it goes beyond just saying, don't worry, we'll protect you. They have to actually take action.
Right. It's a legal obligation.
Fascinating. So we've talked about how the manual addresses the digital age, how cases are categorized, the importance of documentation, and the delicate balance of interacting with victims and witnesses. What are we going to dive into next?
Next, we're going to take a look at some specialized areas of investigation. We'll start with homicide investigations, which are always really interesting, and then we'll move on to firearms, gang activity.
Oh, and of course we can't forget about that mysterious Secret Service fund. Sounds like we have a lot to cover.
We do. I think you're going to find this really interesting.
Okay, so homicides. It's one of those things that just grabs everyone's attention, right? What does the manual say about how these investigations are handled?
Well, the manual really gets into the nitty-gritty. I mean, it stresses how meticulous you got to be with these investigations. And it all starts with the crime scene. Securing that scene is absolutely paramount.
Right, so it's not just about slapping some yellow tape up. What are some of the key things that they emphasize?
Well, they have a very systematic approach. I mean, you have to
Hmm.
establish a perimeter, obviously, and then control who comes in and out. Every single person who enters or exits has to be logged. And of course, you have to document everything, photograph everything.
It must be so important to not contaminate the scene.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And it's not just about physical evidence either. Think about things like smells or sounds or even the temperature. Those things can change quickly, so it's crucial to document them as soon as possible.
It's like capturing a snapshot in time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You want to preserve the scene as it was at the time of the crime as much as possible.
Now, once they've secured the scene, the focus shifts to the victim. What does the manual say about examining the body?
Well, that's where it gets really detailed. They have procedures for everything. Photographing the body from every angle, documenting the position of the body, the location and nature of any wounds, looking for any signs of a struggle.
It's all about trying to piece together what happened.
Right. And the body itself can provide so much information, like what kind of weapon was used, was the victim moved after death, all that kind of stuff.
So it's not just about identifying the victim and determining the cause of death.
It's about understanding the whole story. The body can tell a story if you know how to listen.
And it's not just the body itself, right? What about things like fingerprints, DNA evidence, trace evidence?
Oh, absolutely. That's all part of it. They have very specific procedures for collecting and preserving all types of evidence, making sure it's not contaminated, that it's properly labeled and stored, all of that.
So there's a real emphasis on chain of custody, making sure they can track the evidence from the crime scene all the way to the courtroom.
Exactly. It's crucial for ensuring that the evidence is admissible in court. And speaking of court, let's talk about witnesses.
Okay, yeah. Witness testimony can be so crucial in these cases.
It can make or break a case. So the manual really stresses the importance of how you interact with witnesses, building rapport, putting them at ease, helping them feel comfortable enough to share what they know.
Because sometimes people can be reluctant to come forward, right? They might be scared or they just don't want to get involved.
Absolutely. And that's where detective skills really come into play. You got to be able to read people, understand their motivations, and build trust. And sometimes it can be tough. Like, what if a witness is hostile or uncooperative or even deceptive?
Right, so the manual must give some guidance on how to deal with those situations.
It does. It talks about different interrogation techniques, how to detect deception, all that kind of stuff. It's fascinating, really.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. I want to talk about firearms. Those play a big role in a lot of crimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, they do. And the manual has a whole section on firearms. Everything from how to properly book a firearm into evidence to procedures for handling a situation where a firearm is seized during a domestic violence incident.
I'm guessing there's a lot of paperwork involved.
Tons. It's all about accountability. Every firearm that comes into police custody has to be meticulously tracked.
So no room for error there.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
One mistake could have serious consequences. Now, are you ready for something a little more intense? Let's talk about gangs.
Oh yeah, gangs. I imagine those investigations can get pretty complex.
You're telling me. It's a whole different world. And the manual gets very specific about how to document gang affiliation, how to collect evidence related to gang activities, all of that.
So it's not just about saying, oh, this person looks like a gang member. They need hard evidence.
Right. The manual actually lays out very specific criteria for establishing gang affiliation, like
Mhm.
tattoos, clothing, association with known gang members, things like that.
And what about juveniles who might be involved with gangs?
That's addressed too. There are procedures for parental notification, for trying to intervene and steer these kids away from that lifestyle.
It's a reminder that it's not just about catching criminals, it's about trying to prevent crime in the first place.
Absolutely. Early intervention can make a huge difference. Now, are you ready to delve into one of the more intriguing aspects of this manual?
You mean the Secret Service Fund?
You got it.
Yeah.
I think you're going to find this interesting. So this Secret Service Fund, well, it sounds a lot more exciting than it actually is.
Yeah, I was picturing like briefcases full of cash and secret missions.
Ha ha ha. It's not quite like that. Basically, it's just a special fund that detectives can use for sensitive investigations.
What kind of investigations are we talking about? Give me some examples.
Things like witness relocation, undercover narcotics operations, and vice enforcement. Anything where using regular funds might compromise the investigation or put someone at risk.
I see. So it's all about having some flexibility, being able to operate under the radar when necessary.
Exactly. But don't worry, it's not like they can just spend this money however they want. The manual outlines a very strict process for requesting and accounting for every penny.
That makes sense. There has to be oversight to prevent any abuse.
Oh, absolutely. There are checks and balances in place to ensure everything is above board.
Okay, so let's talk about extradition. I always thought that was a really interesting aspect of law enforcement. What happens when a suspect flees to another state?
Well, it can get pretty complicated. Extradition involves coordinating with authorities in multiple states, getting warrants, navigating all sorts of legal hurdles.
I imagine it can be a logistical nightmare sometimes.
It can be,
Uh,
especially if the suspect is fighting extradition. And then you have to consider the cost of transporting the suspect back to the state where they committed the crime.
so it's not something that they do lightly. They have to weigh the costs and benefits.
Exactly. And the severity of the crime is definitely a factor. They're not going to go through all that trouble for a minor offense.
Right, it has to be worth it.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an incredible journey through the LAPD Detective Operations Manual. I've learned so much about the inner workings of law enforcement and the meticulous processes involved in investigating crimes.
It's been a fascinating dive, hasn't it? Really sheds light on the dedication and expertise of these detectives.
Absolutely. I'm really struck by their commitment to thoroughness and attention to detail. It's clear that every step, from handling evidence to interacting with witnesses, is carefully considered and documented.
It's a reminder that solving crimes is a complex process that requires a lot more than just gut instinct and intuition.
Right. It's a science, really.
Mm.
And the manual serves as a roadmap for navigating that science effectively and ethically.
Well said. And it's important to remember that these investigations are about real people. There are victims, families, and communities impacted by these crimes.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the procedures and the details, but ultimately it's about seeking justice for those who have been harmed.
Absolutely. It's about bringing closure, holding perpetrators accountable, and hopefully preventing future crimes.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything in this deep dive. We've explored the manual's insights on the digital age, the categorization of cases, the importance of documentation, the intricacies of handling evidence, the art of interviewing witnesses, and so much more.
We've even uncovered the secrets of the Secret Service Fund and the complexities of extradition. It's been a wild ride.
It has. And if any of these topics have piqued your interest, I encourage you to do some further exploring. The LAPD website is a great resource, as are legal case archives and scholarly articles on criminal justice.
There's a whole world of information out there for those who are curious about how law enforcement works. And we hope this deep dive has given you a glimpse into that world and sparked some interesting thoughts and questions.
Definitely. So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.